The fire flickers low in the heart of the longhouse. Outside, winter scrapes against the wooden walls with icy fingers. Inside, a woman grips the rough edge of a woolen blanket as a midwife bends over her. No bright hospital lights, no antiseptic. Steel, just smoke, pine tar, and the low hum of chants. A baby's first cry slices through the air like a raven's call. And just like that, another Viking has arrived. But if you were born here, in this world of smoke, snow, and solemn gods, you probably wouldn't survive the week. Viking babies faced one of the highest infant mortality rates in history. Without modern medicine, the cold alone could take them before their first breath had even settled in their lungs. Many wouldn't live long enough to be named. Before we go deeper into this long-forgotten childhood, don't forget to subscribe to the video sharing channel so you don't miss the rest of this world where wooden toys hid real danger. And bedtime stories sounded more like battle cries. Now, breathe in the scent of burnt peat and old fur. The story begins. A Viking child was born into a world that barely flinched at death. Longhouses were communal big wooden structures with low ceilings, thick beams, and smoke that never really left. One hearth in the center, beds along the sides, livestock sometimes roaming the dirt floor, and always the smell of something damp. Childbirth was not private. It happened surrounded by kin, midwives, and often gods, at least in belief. Women would call upon Freya for fertility, and some carved runes into wooden amulets as talismans. But they didn't just pray, they prepared. A low birthing bench, animal pelts for warmth, and boiling water not for cleanliness, but to soften claws. If the baby cried, it was a good sign. If not, the child was sometimes set aside. A brutal decision, but one tied to survival. Vikings had no illusions. A weak child couldn't make it. Exposure, malnutrition, or disease would do worse later. The first days were critical. The child wasn't even named until the 9th night, a tradition rooted in both Norse belief and brutal realism. Until then, the baby was not considered fully part of the clan. That might sound cold, but in a world where every winter threatened famine and every infection spelled disaster, emotional distance was a defense mechanism. Those who lived past those first nights were embraced wrapped in fur-lined cradles, laid near the hearth, rocked to sleep by the gentle creak of beams in the wind. But there was no rest for the parents. Mothers nursed while hauling water, while tending the fire, while watching for wolves. Fathers, if home from raiding or farming, might carve toys, but more often taught older children to make themselves useful. Still, there was tenderness. A father might sing an old saga softly to his child at night. Yes, a lullaby, but in true Viking fashion, the lyrics included trolls, giants, and doomed heroes. Sleep tight. Midwives in Viking society weren't formally trained, but they carried ancestral knowledge passed down from woman to woman. They knew how to position a breech, baby using only instinct and calloused hands. They used wild herbs like yarrow and juniper to ease pain or prevent infection. They rubbed newborns with goose fat in colder months to help keep them warm. Oddly enough, some babies were given carved amber beads to suck on thought to protect against evil spirits. We now know amber contains trace amounts of succinic acid, which may have mild anti-inflammatory properties. Was it medicinal or magical? Hard to say. Historians still debate whether Viking childcare was guided more by superstition or by practical observation of what simply worked. Still, for all their rituals and resilience, Viking families faced gut-wrenching loss. Graves of children under 2 are common in Norse burial grounds. Archaeologists have even uncovered tiny swords and shields buried with them, suggesting a belief in preparing the young for battle, even in the afterlife. That belief in destiny, that fate or word, governed life, also shaped how Viking parents approached child-rearing. Some children were marked early, not by birthmarks, but by omen. A raven flying overhead, a dream involving a wolf, or a strange birth date could signify greatness or doom. And sometimes there were secrets. Skeletal remains from certain dig sites show signs of deformities, curved spines, fused bones that suggest some children were quietly left to die. It's not a topic sagas mention, but the archaeology whispers truths that texts ignore. Still, those who lived were celebrated. On naming day, often the 9th night after birth, the baby was sprinkled with water, a ritual many scholars consider a pagan precursor to baptism and formally welcomed into the clan. A feast might follow, modest or grand depending on harvests. The baby was named after a relative or a legendary warrior believed to carry on their spirit. Naming wasn't cute. It was legacy. And so the child's life truly began, cradled in longhouse smoke, guarded by runes and soothed by stories. The first steps of many on a path filled with frost-bitten fields, myth-bound expectations, and wooden swords. But even then, childhood was not soft. There's a hush in the longhouse, not from silence, but from waiting. A baby lies wrapped in wool, eyes wide, the faintest puff of breath rising in the cold air. Everyone watches, not for movement. For fate. It's the 9th night. And tonight, the child gets a name or vanishes into memory. In Viking society, names weren't just labels. They were destiny in disguise. They tethered a child to their ancestors, to stories, to power. But before that tether could be tied, there was hesitation. For 8 days, the child had no name, no formal place. Only a chance. It was called Vatni. Asa, the naming ritual. Water was poured over the baby's head, not to cleanse, but to claim. The act symbolized acceptance into the family, the clan, and the world of the living. Without it, the child remained in limbo, unnamed, unrecorded, unremembered. And that water? It might have come from the stream behind the farm, or been snowmalt collected in a carved wooden bowl. There was no exact formula, just intention. Names were chosen carefully. Parents didn't just pick what sounded nice. Instead, they pulled from family sagas, local heroes, and even the gods themselves. A girl might be named Astrid, meaning beautiful, loved by the gods. A boy could be Eirik, ever-ruler, or Leif, descendant. Each name carried weight, sometimes literally etched into stones. But the naming wasn't only about reverence. It was about resurrection. Children were often named after recently departed relatives, especially if they were thought to have died too young or too violently. The hope was that the name would give the child a bit of the ancestors' strength, or perhaps let them finish something left undone. In this way, a Viking child could be born already burdened with legacy. One curious tradition, now pieced together through burial inscriptions and oral lore, was that children who showed special qualities, an intense stare, a strong grip, or being born under a rare sky, might be named after warriors or seers, even if no blood relation existed. A kind of spiritual inheritance, but the debate lingers. Historians still argue whether this naming was truly spiritual, or simply a way to preserve bloodlines and titles without legal documents, and not every name was a blessing. Some children were deliberately given names considered ugly or unlucky. Names like Ulf, Wolf, or Scammer, short, may have served as decoys to trick spirits or gods from stealing the child. The idea was that if the gods thought the child was weak or undesirable, they'd leave it alone. A reverse psychology of survival. Even the act of saying a name out loud had power. Sagas are full of moments when a name is spoken solemnly, as if drawing it from another world. To name a child was to say, "You belong here, you are ours, you are real." After the naming, the baby was passed from hand to hand, usually beginning with the father or the matriarch of the household, depending on local customs. There were kisses, murmured blessings, a cup of warmed mead perhaps touched to the lips for luck. And then the celebration began. Of course, not every family could afford a feast. Poorer households might mark the event with a simple extra portion, a food or a carved trinket as a keepsake. But even a spoon of honey or an extra candle could signify joy. Small gestures mattered in a world where life was measured in seasons and spoons. One unusual tradition involved gifting the child a luck object, a stone, bead, or even an animal bone, believed to bring protection. Archaeologists have found these tucked into baby graves, often smooth from wear, as if touched frequently during infancy. Was it a toy? A talisman? Both? And not all names came from the family. Traveling seers known as vulvaes were sometimes consulted during naming rituals. These mysterious women were part priestess, part prophet, part wandering oracle. A vulva might touch the baby's brow and mutter a name none dared question. If she said the child would grow to swing an axe in the king's hall, no one would dare name him sheepherder. Stories also speak of warriors returning from raids with names in their mouths, names of fallen comrades, names of enemy kings, names heard in dreams during seasick nights. These might be gifted to a newborn as tokens of honor or warnings, but what if the child didn't live past the naming? Then the name lived on. It might be reused for the next child of the same gender, a form of symbolic resurrection. Or it might be retired entirely, too painful to speak again. There are burial stones in Scandinavia that mention no names, just runes of mourning. In those cases, it's possible the child lived long enough to be loved, but not long enough to be remembered by title. Viking parents walked a line between deep love and grim pragmatism. They cherished their children, but they understood the odds. A name was hope wrapped in syllables. Even today, Norse names echo across time. In Iceland, naming conventions still link children to their parents, Eiríksson, Gudrun's and in modern Scandinavia, ancient names once whispered over longhouse fires now appear on passports and playgrounds. But in the Viking Age, on that cold ninth night, a name wasn't just identity. It was a shield. The longhouse is never quiet. Even in sleep, it breathes creaking timbers, shifting straw, a low rumble from the livestock huddled nearby. For a Viking infant, this is home. A place where the scent of soot mixes with milk and the lullaby is the scrape of firewood and the distant howl of wind. By modern standards, it sounds harsh. But to the Vikings, it was life. And it began early. Babies didn't rest in pristine cribs. Instead, they were bundled in furs or coarse linen, laid in wooden troughs or repurposed baskets, placed near the hearth to keep warm. Smoke from the central fire would curl above their heads constantly, clinging to their hair, their lungs, their skin, and yet they survived. Sometimes the fire never stopped burning. It was warmth, light, and guardian against spirits, both real and imagined. But it was also a danger. Toddlers often toddled straight toward it. Some sagas mention children getting burned or scarred from stray embers. One Icelandic tale hints at a baby who crawled too close and singed his future. And so, mothers kept an eye out, but they couldn't watch all the time. Viking women were constantly moving, milking goats, churning butter, spinning wool. Babies were often tied onto their mothers with slings or shawls, carried while chores continued. The smell of goat, smoke, and wet wool must have been overpowering, but it was familiar. Comforting, even. Oddly, archaeologists have uncovered child-sized stools carved with animal heads, possibly used to keep babies off the cold floor. Some believe these doubled as charm objects, little thrones to ward off evil. One such stool found in Denmark has a carved bear on each leg, as if the child sat protected by beasts. Diapers, as we know them, didn't exist. Instead, infants were wrapped tightly in layers of linen or animal skin, which were dried and reused. A messy business, no doubt, but part of daily life. In colder months, babies were swaddled to the point of stiffness, held immobile for warmth and supposed spinal support. Some scholars now suggest this may have led to higher rates of rickets, though the data remains debated. And yet, within these smoky walls and woolen bundles, love bloomed. Viking lullabies were often half sagas, stories of ancestors, animals, or the gods. Mothers might hum about Thor's mighty hammer while gently rubbing fat into a baby's cheeks to protect against wind. Fathers, home from raids or hunting trips, sometimes carved toys, tiny boats, spears, or birds on wheels. These were not just playthings, but training tools in disguise. Even sound had its purpose. Rattles made of bones or carved antler filled with seeds were used not just to soothe, but to ward off bad spirits. The Norse believed noise could scare away the unseen. A baby's giggle, in that case, was more than joy, it was protection. But nothing came easy. Babies cried. A lot. And there was no room for extended fussing. If a baby cried too much or couldn't latch, the family's survival might be at risk. In particularly brutal cases, such as deep famine or illness, infanticide was quietly practiced. It's a dark truth whispered in the archaeological record. A newborn's bones found beside a longhouse wall, without burial rites. A tiny skull with signs of trauma, carefully hidden. Not mentioned in sagas, but present all the same. Still, these were exceptions. Most Viking parents fought hard to keep their children alive. One unusual find near Birka, Sweden, revealed a tiny iron charm engraved with protective runes tucked into the bedding of an infant. It's likely this was a deeply personal object, perhaps made by a parent desperate to shield their child from fate. Children who grew past infancy were treasured and watched. Every cough, every change in appetite was noticed. Herbs were brewed for teething, like chamomile and meadowsweet. Warm goat milk mixed with ash was used for stomach troubles. Seaweed poultices were applied to rashes. Viking healing wasn't always effective, but it was earnest. They used what they had and hoped the gods approved. Historians still debate whether certain healing rites were grounded in observation or mysticism. Was juniper burned for its antimicrobial properties or simply because it smelled sacred? Was the midwife's chant a form of hypnosis or merely tradition? Either way, Viking children grew up soaked in both fire and folklore. Their first steps were taken not in silence, but to the rhythm of clanking iron pots, sloshing buckets, and the endless retelling of old tales. Toddlers stumbled across furs, slipped on planks, and learned to keep balance by reaching for rough wooden walls. One odd tale tells of a child learning to walk by holding onto the tail of a patient dog, a large farm mastiff that acted as both babysitter and balance bar. It sounds like a bedtime fable, but animal bones buried beside child remains suggest strong bonds were real. And then there was weaning. Breastfeeding often continued for 2, even 3 years. Weaning was slow and careful, often involving softened grains or mashed vegetables. Meat came later, usually in broths. Teething babies were given knuckle bones to chew, practical and oddly symbolic, gnawing on the bones of their future. So by the time a Viking child could walk, they had already tasted ash, smoke, bone, and wool. Their lungs were tougher than leather. Their ears had memorized stories older than trees. Their hands reached for the world, not in innocence, but in preparation. Because in this world, childhood was never a pause before life. It was life in its rawest form. Out in the yard, between the goat pen and the woodpile, a small group of children gathers. One holds a stick like a sword. Another crouches low, pretending to be a wolf. A third stands proudly, arms out, declaring themselves king of the fjord. There are no slides, no screens, no soft mats. But there is imagination, and there is intent. In the Viking world, play wasn't just fun. It was training. From the moment they could walk steadily, Viking children were expected to learn through imitation. And the line between play and preparation was often invisible. A child's toy could be a future tool. A game of pretend might echo the real conflicts of adult life. In the soft, smoky light of the longhouse yard, the next generation of warriors, farmers and weavers, was already rehearsing. One common game involved mock combat. Boys, and sometimes girls, would fashion wooden swords or spears from branches. Using shields made of bark or stretched hide, they'd square off in battles that mimicked what they saw in the sagas. There were rules, of course: no eye gouging. No real blood, but bruises were common, and pride was earned. Even more curious were the strategy games. Archaeologists have uncovered small game boards carved into stone or bone, with pieces used for games like Nefatov, a kind of Viking chess. While the rules varied from region to region, the focus was always the same: surround the enemy's king. This wasn't idle fun. It was mental conditioning for battle, for leadership, and for knowing when to retreat. Meanwhile, younger children mimicked household tasks. Small wooden rakes, buckets, and looms have been found in graves and settlements, often scaled down to town. Fit little hands. Girls might pretend to card wool beside their mothers, humming half-remembered songs. Boys might trail behind their fathers, mimicking the way they lifted a hay bale or checked a fence. One odd discovery in Norway revealed a tiny replica of a blacksmith's anvil, no bigger than a child's palm, buried beside a 6-year-old. Was it a toy, a memorial, a promise? Historians still debate whether it represented a child's lineage or a future that was cut short. Not all play was so symbolic. Some games were simple and wild: running, shouting, leaping over low walls, or balancing on slippery river rocks. Winters brought snowball fights, sled races down packed hills, and indoor games like riddle-telling or hand-slapping contests around the fire. Children would laugh, shout, even squabble. And parents, though often tired, knew this was all part of growing. And then there were the animal games. Dogs, cats, goats, even geese became unwitting companions. Children learned about care by helping feed them, clean after them, or chase them down when they wandered. One saga recounts a child tying bells to a goat and declaring it a war horse. Another mentions a child riding a pig before getting tossed off into a pile of straw. A scene both hilarious and likely based on truth, but play had darker edges too. In some communities, older boys staged mock trials, recreating the thing, the Viking legal assembly. They'd accuse one another of imaginary crimes, stealing a chicken, insulting Odin, and act out the punishments. This could range from pretend exile to mock executions, usually involving dramatic collapses into hay. It sounds grim, but these rituals helped reinforce social norms and respect for law. Some scholars now believe these role-plays were encouraged by elders, who saw them as safe ways to channel youthful energy into understanding justice and loyalty. Others argue it was just childhood mischief with a hint of menace. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. One thing's clear: Viking adults watched closely. Play wasn't idle time. It was observation time. A child who showed bravery, patience, or leadership might be quietly marked for future responsibilities. A girl who organized games fairly could later manage trade negotiations. A boy who helped a younger sibling without being told might be considered good husbandly material. These moments mattered. And they left traces. Burial sites of children often include more than simple toys. Some are interred with mini versions of adult tools, knives, beads, farm implements. These weren't just symbols of what they were, they pointed to what they could have been. One particularly haunting grave in Jutland contains a 10-year-old boy buried with a full-size shield and a scaled-down axe, wrapped in a cloak embroidered with ravens. Was he training to be a warrior, or had he already seen battle? Historians argue still. The sagas are silent, but the soil speaks. As much as play prepared children for roles, it also connected them to memory. Many games were accompanied by rhymes, oral traditions that mixed nonsense with truth. A girl skipping stones might chant a verse about Loki stealing fish. A boy balancing on one foot could be enacting Thor's contest against a giant's daughter. It's easy to imagine laughter echoing across the fjords, but even easier to forget how thin the line was between joy and hardship. A broken ankle meant days of limping. A snowball in the wrong eye could lead to infection. Still, play persisted. Because to grow up Viking was to wrestle with danger and delight in equal measure. Some things don't change. Children still dream, imagine, and run until they fall. But in the Viking Age, every stumble had a purpose. Every game was a seed of survival. Near the loom, beneath a window carved from stretched animal bladder, a girl sits quietly threading a bone needle. She is 6, maybe 7, but already her fingers move with purpose. Beside her, an older sister spins wool, while their mother hums low and steady. A few feet away, a boy sharpens a stick against stone, testing its weight like a blade. No one tells him to stop. This is learning. And in Viking life, gender shaped everything. From the moment a child could walk without wobbling, expectations settled over them like a second skin. Girls were trained to manage the hearth. Boys were prepared to defend the homestead. It wasn't cruel, just practical. In the Viking world, every hand counted, and childhood was less a pause than a race to readiness. By age 5 or 6, girls were handed flax and wool instead of toys. They learned to card, spin, weave, and dye, skills crucial to survival. Textiles were currency, and a good weaver brought prestige to her household. Daughters watched their mother's hands until they could mimic them in their sleep. A single poorly tied knot could ruin a sail, but a well-woven tunic, that could buy favor, protection, or a husband. Meanwhile, boys were given tools. Not toys that looked like tools, real ones. Axes with blunted edges, fishing spears cut from willow, small knives handed over with trust and quiet instruction. They were taught to chop wood, snare birds, patch boats. At first, these were mimicries. By 10, they were contributions, but it wasn't only about chores. Roles were passed down through subtle rituals. A girl might be invited to help mix dye for the first time, a messy, magical experience involving crushed plants, animal urine, and days of waiting. If the colors held, it meant she was ready. A boy might be taken to the woods by his uncle and taught to track deer, read the trees, or sit completely still as a raven landed nearby. These moments were rarely announced, but they were remembered. Oddly enough, Viking girls often trained in weapon use too. Not for battle, but for protection. In times of raid or absence of men, women defended homesteads fiercely. One saga tells of a young girl who hid under a bench with a knife and stabbed an intruder in the ankle, buying her family time to escape. Whether fact or myth, it reveals the layered expectations placed on even the smallest shoulders. There were overlaps, of course. Not all boys became warriors, and not all girls stayed at the loom. Children of blacksmiths might learn metalwork regardless of gender. A boy with an ear for music might be given a lyre. A girl with sharp wit might be taught law songs and runes. The society had rules, but it also had flexibility when talent showed itself. Still, the pressure was real. A daughter who ruined cloth could bring shame. A son who failed to lift a bow might be mocked by peers. Jokes were often gentle, but they stung. Can't find the goose's neck, they might say to a girl with clumsy sewing, or misses the sea from the boat to a boy who fumbled in fishing. These jabs nudged children toward competence and reminded them that eyes were always watching. One peculiar practice, noted in Icelandic law scrolls, involved assigning children mock titles. A particularly clever girl might be called Little Law Speaker. A boy who handled animals well could earn Calf King. These titles weren't permanent, but they gave pride and sometimes foreshadowed future standing. And yes, there was laughter. A boy might declare himself king of the midden pile after chasing off a pig. A girl might braid her brother's hair into a ridiculous nest when he fell asleep near the fire. Life was too short, too raw, to live without teasing. Jokes echoed through longhouses like a second kind of hearth. Historically, there's ongoing debate about just how strict these roles were. Some scholars argue that sagas exaggerate gender norms for dramatic effect. Others insist that archaeological patterns, burials with tools for boys, spindle whorls for girls, prove otherwise. But evidence also reveals exceptions. A famous grave in Burka, long thought to hold a male warrior, was revealed through DNA testing to be a woman buried with swords, horses, and command, which raises the question, how much choice did children really have? The answer is as complex as any family. Some parents may have encouraged non-traditional paths. Others, especially those with status to protect, likely enforced roles more rigidly. A chieftain's daughter couldn't be seen mending shoes in public. A bondservant's son might never touch a sword. Yet, even within these lanes, there was room to move. One young boy in a farming village near Trondheim was known for weaving fishing nets better than any of his sisters. His burial included a bone, needle, and a fishing hook, suggesting his skill was celebrated, not silenced. His story, unearthed only recently, adds texture to our understanding, and the skills taught weren't just manual. Children learned when to speak, when to listen, how to host guests with grace, and how to recite family lineage without error. A well-mannered child reflected honor on the household. A rude one, that was a stain. Politeness was power. So was knowing which seat an uncle should take, which joke was too far, and when to refill a guest's cup. But beneath all the tasks, the training, the tools and threads, was something deeper, the sense that they were part of something old and important. A daughter wove cloth not just for warmth, but for trade, survival, and pride. A son chopped wood not just for fire, but to protect the clan. Every stitch, every splinter mattered. And so, childhood in the Viking world wasn't a waiting room for adulthood. It was the workshop of identity. Night settles early in the north. The longhouse dims, lit only by the fire's gentle glow and the occasional flicker from oil lamps set in shallow stone bowls. Outside, frost climbs the walls. Inside, stories awaken. An old man clears his throat, and all eyes, young and old, turn toward him. He leans forward, voice low but clear, and begins. Long ago, when the world was still shaped by giants. In Viking life, children were raised not just by parents, but by stories. Sagas, songs, riddles, and poems formed the scaffolding of their minds. These weren't simply entertainment. They were instruction manuals for life, law, and legacy. Every evening, after the tools were hung and the animals fed, children would gather near the fire to listen. The sagas told of gods and monsters, but also of local heroes, family feuds, and clever tricksters. And they always carried a lesson. One evening might feature a tale of Thor smashing a mountain with his hammer, teaching strength and courage. The next, a quiet story of a farmer who survived famine through clever bartering, teaching resilience and wit. Some stories warned of betrayal, others of the high cost of pride. And children soaked it in. They recited family lineages like prayers, memorized ancestral names going back generations. This wasn't vanity, it was vital. In a world without birth certificates or written contracts, your name and who it belonged to could mean land, loyalty, or revenge. The oral tradition served as law school, history class, and bedtime ritual, all at once. And the children, they weren't passive. They interrupted, asked questions, laughed, guessed endings. Sometimes they corrected details, much to the storyteller's mock dismay. Elders cherished these moments, not just for the stories, but for the bonding. This was how values were passed: respect, loyalty, patience. It was how jokes were taught, voices imitated, and empathy stirred. One curious tale, preserved in fragmented poetry, describes a child reciting a saga so well that a visiting trader gave him a silver coin on the spot. The boy later used that coin to buy a carved bead for his mother, a small story within a larger one, and a reminder of the role of memory in Viking culture. But sagas weren't the only lessons. Children also learned the laws. Viking society had no centralized justice system. Instead, law was upheld by memory and performance. From a young age, children, especially boys, were expected to know how the thing assembly worked. What crimes were punishable by exile? What oaths could be sworn by what gods? Even small disputes at home were sometimes settled through mock trials. A missing wooden spoon, a broken comb? Someone might be brought before the family and asked to defend themselves, half joking, half serious. These rituals weren't just amusing, they prepared children for adulthood in a society where words could kill or redeem. Public speaking was key. A child with a loud voice and good memory could become a valuable ally in disputes. Families noticed. Praise was subtle, maybe a second helping of stew, or a nod from an uncle, but it mattered. And runes, those mysterious symbols carved into wood and stone, weren't off limits to children. While most Viking children weren't formally taught to read, many learned the Elber Futhark runes by imitation. Carving them into bones, benches, or sticks, they practiced letters the way modern kids draw hearts and stars. One unusual find near a farmstead in Gotland includes a child's wooden toy with runes carved along the edges. Not full words, just initials. Scholars believe the child may have been copying a parent's carving, much like a child today mimicking a signature. Some historians argue this hints at early literacy, at least among the elite or craft families. Others say it was just doodling. As always, historians still debate the line between play and pedagogy. Children also learned through Kenning's Norse poetic metaphors. A sword might be woonho, the sea whale road. These weren't just fancy words. They shaped how children saw the world. Life wasn't simple. It was layered, like language. And those layers could protect. In times of stress, illness, storms, fear, children could recite comforting phrases. Thor guards the roof beams, they might whisper during thunder. Freya hears lost cries during sleepless nights. These sayings became a kind of emotional armor. In the absence of certainty, repetition gave stability. But not all stories were kind. There were tales meant to frighten children into caution. Trolls who stole loud babies, Huldra who kidnapped wandering boys, sea serpents who dragged reckless swimmers into the deep. These stories weren't cruelty, they were protection. A way to keep children close to home and alert to danger. One saga warns of a child who mocked Odin, only to lose their voice forever. Whether true or not, it reminded little ears to watch their tongues and honor the gods. Interestingly, girls were often allowed to learn storytelling just as fluently as boys. Though formal education skewed male, the hearth was democratic. If a girl told a tale well, she'd be asked to repeat it. Her voice mattered. And when she married, she'd take those stories with her, spreading wisdom across families and fjords. The hearth was the Viking child's first classroom, and the elders were their books. No paper, no ink. Just memory, rhythm, and voice. And though the stories were old, the faces listening to them were new, wide-eyed, curious, ready. In the Viking world, bedtime was never quiet. It was filled with thunder, wolves, and whispered lessons. Smoke curls gently from the hearth as the cold deepens outside. A child stirs beneath a wool blanket, but there's no rush to rise. The smell of the early fire lingers, mingling with the faint scent of dried herbs hanging overhead. Morning in a Viking household begins not with alarm, but with rhythm. Quiet, practiced rhythm. By the time the first rays touch the carved wood of the long house beams, Viking children are already learning, but not with slates and chalkboards. With hands. In Viking society, the earliest education came through doing. Tasks weren't segregated from learning, they were the learning. From the moment a child could walk and speak, they were gradually pulled into the pulse of household work. A 4-year-old might be given a small wooden bowl to carry water. A 6-year-old might stir porridge under watchful eyes. By 7 or 8, they'd know how to feed the animals, stack peat for fire, or gather eggs without breaking them. These weren't chores. They were rehearsals for life, and the tasks grew with the child. Boys were often assigned to their father's shadow, absorbing the crafts of farming, fishing, woodworking, or herding. Girls learned from mothers and aunts cooking, weaving, dyeing, preserving food, but it wasn't strictly divided. Many boys could sew. Many girls could gut fish. The family's survival depended on flexibility. One peculiar detail emerges in excavated tools, small knives, clearly functional but scaled for children's hands. Found near settlements in Norway and Denmark, these suggest that children weren't just watching, they were practicing. Whittling wooden pegs, carving toy boats, or even learning to fashion small fishhooks. Some historians point to these finds as evidence of structured apprenticeship, beginning informally within the home. Others caution against modern projections, noting that many of these tools could simply reflect play imitating life. Still, the hands of Viking children were always busy, but learning wasn't just technical. It was relational. Older children often mentored younger ones. This wasn't dictated, it just happened. A 10-year-old boy might show his 5-year-old brother how to tie a rope to a sled. A 12-year-old girl might teach her sister how to pack dried fish into a clay pot without letting air spoil it, and in return, those children were praised. Not with medals or grades, but with real acknowledgement. A grandmother might say, "You saved us time," or "You'll make a good husband one day." These words mattered deeply. They marked growth. They meant belonging. Sometimes, children learned through subtle trials. An adult might forget to salt the goat meat, watching to see if the child remembered the step. Or a father might ask a son to choose between 2 fishing lines, gauging his eye for strength and wear. No punishment. Just observation. Correction came later, in quiet tones by the fire. Curiously, many Viking settlements reveal remnants of games woven into these lessons. Knucklebones from goats served as dice. Wooden animals carved from scraps became part of guessing games. Children might stack stones to create impromptu obstacle courses or pretend to trade goods using pebbles and twigs. One Icelandic tale even describes children playing a mock thing, their version of a legal assembly, where they took turns accusing each other of stealing imaginary cows. A humorous detail, yes, but also telling. Even their games mimicked real life. Weaving and textile work offered another avenue for deep learning, especially among girls. A child might start with carding wool, gently teasing and fluffing it for spinning. By 10, she could likely spin rough thread. By 13, she might know how to weave a band or dye cloth with lichen or crushed berries. Spinning wasn't just technical, it was sacred. The Norns, mythological weavers of fate, shaped lives by thread. Every twist of yarn was a reflection of that belief. A girl who spun smoothly wasn't just useful, she was aligned with cosmic harmony. And boys? Boys trained through movement. Not just by swinging wooden swords or hurling stones, but by lifting heavy logs, pushing carts, climbing trees to retrieve firewood. These were practical workouts. They built the muscles needed for rowing, raiding, or resisting the next blizzard. 1 odd detail unearthed in a coastal village includes a row of small, fist-sized stones arranged in a line. Some believe it was part of a child's lifting game testing strength and balance. Others think it might have been a ritual path. No one's certain. But someone, long ago, laid them down with intent. By adolescents around age 12 or 13, children were often functionally adults. They could contribute to the household, hunt small game, mend tools, prepare meals, and speak at local gatherings. But there was still play, even as responsibilities mounted. Viking children carved out moments of joy. Snowball fights, racing sleds over ice, singing songs with exaggerated verses, mock swordplay using branches, or simply lying beneath the summer sky, counting stars and guessing which god each might belong to. And sometimes, amid all the routines and rituals, a child would stumble, drop a pot, miss a step, forget to tether the goat. In those moments, the response wasn't wrath, it was teaching. A gentle word, a firm grip on the shoulder. A story about a boy who once did the same and became a chieftain anyway. In the Viking world, learning was constant, immersive, and deeply human. No bells marked the start of lessons. No books separated knowledge from life. Education was a river, flowing through everything, shaping every stone it touched. And the children? They were never just learning to live. They were living to learn. The sun barely clears the horizon, and already 2 boys are wrestling in the frozen dirt near the longhouse. Not in anger, but in practice. A small circle of younger children watches, giggling as one gets flipped onto his back with a satisfying thump. Then both boys stand, brush off the snow, and grin. This isn't just roughhousing. It's training. And in the Viking world, training began early, especially for boys. By the age of 7 or 8, most Viking children were already being prepared for the possibility of warfare. Not because every boy would become a warrior, but because every family understood that violence was never far away. Whether it was defending the farm from raiders or joining a local feud, strength and readiness mattered. But here's the twist: formal training schools didn't exist. Instead, warrior skills were passed down person to person, father to son, uncle to nephew, neighbor to neighbor. It happened in the fields, during downtime after chores, or in the long twilight of summer evenings. The first lessons were deceptively simple: how to balance on uneven ground, how to fall without injury, how to breathe when lifting a heavy log. These skills weren't labeled combat, but they were. A warrior who couldn't move smoothly would die clumsily. And no parent wanted that. Sometimes, boys were given wooden practice swords or spears to swing. Not sharp, not deadly, but enough to teach muscle memory. They'd spar in pairs, with older children coaching the younger ones. One might shout, "Step forward with your left foot," or "Don't drop your shield arm," while laughing at a friend's awkward footwork. Girls didn't always participate in weapon training, but they weren't forbidden either. In rare sagas and folklore, shield maidens appear women who could fight as fiercely as men. While many historians debate whether these figures were symbolic or real, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Some girls did train. Some even followed their fathers into battle. Historians still debate whether Viking society encouraged organized youth combat training or if it remained informal and family-based. What's clear is that physical preparedness was a universal expectation. Even if a boy never fought a raid, he was expected to haul loads, hunt boar, or stand his ground when the time came. And combat wasn't just about swinging a weapon. Archery was a valued skill. Children were often taught to shoot small targets from a distance: animal skulls, circles drawn in the dirt, or even stacked bones. A good shot meant dinner. A poor one meant empty bellies, and there was more. Boys might be taught to throw javelins or axes, chase each other through obstacle courses, or climb tall trees and towers, not just for sport, but for confidence. A high vantage point could save a life. So could a steady hand in a tense moment. One unusual find near a settlement in Rib, Denmark, included a child-sized leather helmet, carefully stitched and reinforced. Not decorative, functional. Perhaps it belonged to the son of a local warrior, made by hand for early training. Its existence suggests that mock battles were not only common, but taken seriously, and they had rules. Older boys often organized these mock battles into teams. Two groups might face off in the woods, setting imaginary boundaries, establishing goals like capture the log or hold the hill. These weren't mindless brawls. They mimicked real raids with tactics, stealth, and alliances. Occasionally, a child would return with a bruised arm or scraped chin, but rarely anything worse. The goal was to learn, not to harm. As children grew, so did the risks and the lessons. At age 12 or 13, a boy might accompany his father on a short voyage, not to raid necessarily, but to row, to haul cargo, to sleep in cramped boats, to feel the sea spray in his face and hear the creak of the mast at midnight. All part of his transformation into a man. One saga tells of a boy named Eric, who at 14 was left alone on a forest trail with only a knife and a piece of dried meat. His task? Survive the night and return with a fox pelt. Whether legend or truth, such trials weren't unheard of. They tested courage, wit, and endurance. Meanwhile, elders continued to guide. A grandfather might sit by the fire, recounting battles from his youth, exaggerating for drama, but always embedding lessons. A spear must be thrown before it's feared. A coward dies many deaths. A true warrior knows when not to fight. The balance. was crucial. Viking society admired strength, but it despised reckless violence. Children were taught not just how to fight, but when. Honor mattered. Family name mattered. And reputation could outlive any sword. One Old Norse saying taught to many boys went something like this: "Cattle die, kinsmen die, the self must also die." But the glory of reputation never dies. Harsh, perhaps, but motivating. Especially to a 12-year-old hoping to be remembered. Oddly, training wasn't always violent. Many forms of mental discipline accompanied physical toughness. Memory games, riddles, even board games like Nefetaf, a Viking strategy game akin to chess, were played at night. These helped sharpen the mind. A warrior who couldn't outthink his enemy wouldn't live long, and laughter remained essential. One boy might feign a dramatic sword wound after being tapped by a stick, collapsing into snow with a theatrical gasp. Another might challenge 3 friends at once, armed only with a broom. These moments weren't frivolous, they strengthened. Bonds. By the time a boy reached 15, he was expected to know the basics: how to track an animal, defend a home, navigate by the stars, and hold his temper in a storm. He might not yet be ready for war, but he was ready for life. In the quiet moments between training, older boys often mentored the younger. One might tie a sash for a 5-year-old, whispering, "That's how real warriors wear their belts." A simple gesture, but meaningful. It built a ladder of knowledge, step by step, and occasionally, even the fiercest boy would sneak back to his mother's hearth, cheeks red from cold or pride, asking for a hot stew or an extra blanket, because, no matter how brave, every warrior was still someone's child. By the time Viking children reached their teenage years, the line between childhood and adulthood had begun to blur. At around 15 or 16, many were already viewed as adults by their communities, not in a symbolic or ceremonial way, but in their daily responsibilities and expectations. For boys, this often meant full participation in the life of the village or farm. They now helped make real decisions: when to plant, when to fish, which animals to cull. If their family owned a boat, they rowed it not as learners but as crew. If a trade expedition set sail, they might be trusted to negotiate guard cargo, or even represent the family in a marketplace abroad. Girls, too, reached maturity early in Viking society. By their mid-teens, many were managing households, overseeing food stores, making medicines, and spinning or weaving for trade. Some were even married by this point, joining new families and assuming the duties of a wife and mother while barely out of childhood. But it wasn't just about labor or marriage. This stage of life was also when Viking youth were tested quietly, informally, but with real consequences. A boy might be asked to stay behind during a raid and protect the village in his father's absence. A girl might be left to manage the winter larder during a brutal season. How they performed mattered deeply, and though not all were destined to become warriors or traders, every teenager was expected to contribute meaningfully. Even those with physical limitations or special needs were often given adapted roles. Viking society, for all its harshness, valued each person's capacity to serve the community. One of the most telling rituals at this age wasn't a grand feast or naming ceremony, but the first time a young person was entrusted with a weapon. A father might hand his son a real axe, not dulled, not symbolic, and say, "Keep this sharp. Keep your word sharper." That moment marked a turning point. It wasn't just about battle. It was about trust. The boy was no longer training, he was responsible. For girls, the right might come in the form of a keys gift. A set of iron keys, often handed down through generations, represented the management of the household and its secrets, grains, medicines, ledgers, and locked chests. In Viking culture, women wielded real economic power, and those keys symbolized it. But with trust came pressure. Mistakes at this age weren't brushed off. A careless word could damage a family's reputation. A failed task might risk survival. And while parents still watched, they did so from a growing distance, letting their children stumble and learn, even when the stakes were high. During the long dark winters, teens often sat with adults around the hearth, no longer at the children's end of the bench. They asked questions, debated legends, and even challenged ideas, carefully, respectfully. These conversations were training, too. A future leader needed to speak well, listen wisely, and know when to hold silence. Not every Viking child rose to prominence. Most lived hard, honest lives close to the soil and sea. But some, through bravery, cunning, or sheer endurance, began building names that would echo beyond their village. One such figure was Olaf Tryggvason, said to have been born in exile and raised under threat of assassination. By his teens, he was already a sailor and warrior, and by adulthood, a king. His story, like many Viking sagas, is part history, part myth, but it reflects the expectations placed on youth in that world. Survival wasn't enough. Legacy was the goal. And so, even as teens matured, they never stopped learning. Elders remained mentors, their voices carrying lessons sharpened by loss and victory. Some taught from memory. Others taught from scars. One blacksmith near Birka was said to have trained 3 sons, none of whom became smiths. "Good," he reportedly told the traveler. "They should be better than me." That sentiment, demanding more from the next generation, was core to Viking life. Yet despite the harshness, there was warmth too. Songs were sung around fires, not just to pass time but to bind hearts. Young men carved runes into gifts for sweethearts. Young women wove secret knots into tunics for boys they hoped would return. These weren't people hardened beyond love. They were people who knew how fragile love could be and clung to it all the more fiercely. In this stage of life, laughter was richer, deeper. It carried pride. Teenagers laughed at their childhood selves, at their first failed hunt, their awkward sword grip, the time they slipped in front of the village elder. These memories became stories, told with joy rather than shame. And the final phase of their training, perhaps the most important, was legacy. Around age 17 or 18, young Vikings began to be judged not as youth, but as full members of society. Their actions had long-term consequences. Their choices defined their family's standing. And in some cases, their lives would be recorded in sagas, whispered in longhouses centuries later. Did they honor the gods? Did they defend the helpless? Did they lead with wisdom or foolishness? These questions became their silent trials, because in the Viking world, childhood was not a protected garden. It was a path through wind and flame. And those who emerged from it were not just grown, they were forged. The journey from youth to adulthood in Viking society was never truly complete without one final test. The moment a child, now grown, stood shoulder to shoulder with their elders, not in the warmth of the hearth, but in the heat of a challenge. That revealed what they were truly made of. Sometimes this test arrived quietly. A sudden illness might take a parent, and the oldest child would need to step up overnight, managing fields, guiding younger siblings, speaking in village gatherings, with the voice of someone who hadn't yet grieved but could not afford to cry. Other times, it came with thunder raids, storms, famine, or the flickering torchlight of a legal assembly where one's words could change the course of a family's fortune. But no matter how it came, it was understood. The child had passed through the fire. From this point onward, a young Viking's name began to carry weight. Their decisions mattered beyond their home. They could now forge alliances, start families of their own, and, crucially, leave their mark. This was the point where legends began, or where they fizzled into forgotten chores and debts unpaid. Some sought fame across the seas, others built renown within the village, and some those who bore witness to both hardship and quiet honor chose service over song. Not all heroes held swords. Some held scrolls, hammers, or healing hands. Among them was a young woman from Hidibi who chose to become a bone setter, traveling from farm to farm with her basket of herbs and stiff linen bandages. She was said to mend warriors better than priests' prayers. Her patients carved runes for her into birch bark as thanks. She never married, but her name was spoken in 10 villages long after her death. This is where odd truths slip in. Despite the Viking image of roaring men on dragon-proud ships, many of the community's most respected figures were quiet fixers, peacemakers, or healers. There are recorded instances of men who wept in public over sons lost to fever, wives taken by childbirth, or kin slain in feuds. Instead of mockery, these men often earned reverence. The tears of a strong man, Viking belief held, were heavier than iron. Still, for many, the defining moment of adulthood was tied to one rite, standing at the wing. The wing was the great assembly, a mixture of courtroom, parliament, and festival. It was where disputes were aired, land ownership debated, alliances sworn, and judgments cast. For a young adult to speak at the wing, or even just attend and observe, was a sign that they had joined the ranks of society's decision-makers. But it was no easy gathering. The wing was a dangerous place for the unprepared. Words carried weight, and a slip of the tongue could earn enemies or debt. It was here that many learned the power of silence and the greater power of a well-timed question. Historians still debate whether youth were allowed to vote or only speak. Goes one scholarly debate, though many sources suggest that influence mattered more than formal votes. A clever young farmer could shape a vote through whispered advice, even if not permitted to cast it himself. This blending of maturity and cunning was celebrated in saga tales. One such story tells of a boy who tricked a local chieftain out of a boat through clever riddles and an offer of salted cod. While likely fictional, it underscores what Viking parents hoped their children would become: sharp, capable, and just a little bit mischievous. The idea of earned adulthood also brought unusual consequences. Some adults, due to cowardice or dishonor, were treated with less respect than brave teens. In this society, age alone meant little. A 15-year-old who led a successful cattle raid might outrank a 40-year-old known for broken promises. Respect had to be earned and re-earned constantly. And yet, not everything was a test. There were moments between the labor and the law where laughter and music took over. Summer feasts saw dancing, game playing, and storytelling. Young men challenged each other to rock-lifting contests, archery games, or skaldic poetry duels. Young women braided flower crowns and shared dreams beneath open skies. Matches were made in those fleeting summer hours, and some ended in marriage, others in friendly rivalry that lasted a lifetime. But make no mistake, marriage, too, was a serious transition. Though many Viking unions were arranged, they were not without choice or consent. Both partners were expected to bring value, skills, goods, status. A mismatched pair could bring ruin, and parents knew this. A marriage was more than a bond between two people. It was an alliance between families, a redrawing of boundaries, a merger of livestock, farmland, and lineage. As such, those entering into marriage had to understand the weight of it. A poorly managed home could lead to hunger or shame. A well-run one to decades of prosperity. And so, as Viking children moved into adulthood, the web of their lives thickened. Friendships became alliances. Rivalries could harden into feuds or melt into unexpected peace. The adult world was complex, but those raised in Viking fashion were rarely unprepared, because everything they'd done up until now, the chores, the stories, the training, the teasing, the lessons whispered at dusk, all of it was designed to prepare them for this. One unusual rite, mentioned in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript, describes a group of young adults marking their final step into adulthood by spending a night alone on an island. No food, no fire, no help. Just their thoughts, the cold stars, and the sea. What mattered was not how they survived, but what truths they returned with, whether real or myth. The story offers a glimpse into Viking belief. Adulthood was not just about skills or strength. It was about reflection, about knowing who you were when no one was watching. And so, the final shape of a Viking adult was not carved by swords or stitched by hands, but quietly, under snow and moonlight, by choices made when no one else could. Decide for you. The training of a Viking child didn't stop at age. It ended at understanding. From the outside, Viking society could seem harsh, unyielding in its demands, rooted in strength, survival, and law. But for those raised within it, childhood wasn't a sheltered pause before adulthood. It was the beginning of a lifetime apprenticeship. One where the lessons were lived, not just learned. And even as children became adults, the cycle didn't end. They became the teachers, the storytellers, the ones who now stood beside the hearth or in the fields, watching small feet run through frost-bitten grass, remembering what it was like to be 7 and handed a bucket too heavy. They knew the weight of those early years and respected it, because, in the Viking worldview, children were not just extensions of the family. They were living threads in the long tapestry of ancestry. They carried bloodlines, names, and legacies. The way they were raised reflected not only on the parents, but on the entire kin group. That's why discipline was taken seriously. But not in the way modern audiences might assume. Punishment for misbehavior was often social and corrective, not just punitive. Public embarrassment, like being given a woman's chore for a boy or sitting at the edge of the feasting hall, was more effective than beatings. The goal wasn't humiliation but reintegration, to make sure the child understood their place and how to regain honor. But some missteps were not so easily forgiven. Theft from kin, betrayal of oaths, or cowardice in defense of one's family, these could stain a reputation for decades, even generations. And so children were warned early, what you do now echoes after you die. This belief echoes after death permeated every stage of Viking life, which is why training children wasn't just about the now. It was about shaping who they would be remembered as. One rune carver wrote of his son, "He is not yet a man, but I have seen his courage. Let the gods see it too." That carving, weather-worn but still legible, sits beside a fjord in what is now Norway. A father's pride, captured in stone. These remnants, carvings, sagas, burial gifts are what give historians clues about Viking childhood, but much remains a mystery. Unlike adults, children left behind few possessions. Their graves, when found, often contained simple tokens, a toy boat, a necklace, a bone comb. These whisper of tenderness, of love amidst hardship. Some of the most haunting archaeological finds are graves where children are buried beside adults, sometimes parents, sometimes strangers. In a few cases, the children were buried with miniature tools or weapons, as if to say, they were ready, even if they never got the chance. These graves tell a powerful story. That childhood, however brief, was valued. That death did not erase a child's role in the clan or community. That even in a world of warriors and raiders, softness was not weakness, it was memory. And that memory lived on in story. Skalds, poets, and keepers of oral tradition occasionally told tales of childhood. Not just the hero's adulthood feats, but where they came from. A warrior whose axe sang across battlefields might first be remembered for stealing honeycomb from a bear. A shield maiden who led fleets at sea might have once been the girl who ran faster than every boy in the village. These stories reminded listeners greatness had roots, and often those roots were tangled in mischievous smiles, scraped knees, and quiet courage shown before the world was watching. As Viking society changed, especially with the coming of Christianity, the decline of raiding, and the rise of more structured laws, the way children were raised also began to shift. Christian teachings introduced new ideas of discipline, sin, and moral instruction. Schools attached to churches began to teach Latin, scripture, and writing, especially to boys from noble or wealthy families. For some, this was a golden opportunity. For others, it marked a separation from the old ways. Still, the essence of Viking childhood persisted for centuries in rural areas, learning by doing, honoring kin, and preparing for life's tests. And what of girls, whose stories so often went unwritten? Their training often began earlier and ended later than their brothers. As caregivers, household managers, and bearers of lineage, their roles were pivotal. A competent woman could determine whether a family thrived or starved. whether peace was kept or blood was spilled. And they knew it. Many girls were taught to read the weather, track herd movement, or brew medicine from roots. Some trained with blades not for raids, but for defense. Others learned songs that soothed infants or curses that sent grown men. One saga tells of a girl named Brynhild who, at 12, negotiated a land dispute between two families and prevented a blood feud. She did not fight, but she won. Her name was later carved into the wooden beams of the longhouse she saved. Today, modern scholars and reenactors continue to debate and reconstruct Viking childhood. Was it cruel or empowering? Was it freer than medieval Christian childhood or more brutal? The answer, perhaps, is both. It was a world where you might be loved fiercely, yet expected to haul water before your hands stopped growing. Where lullabies were sung beside blades. Where bedtime stories involved gods, monsters, and ancestors watching your every move, and where a child's best teacher was life itself. The Viking world didn't pause for childhood. It folded it into everything. In laughter, in scars, in silence, in song. And if you stood by the fire in a Viking home at night, listening as a child tied knots in twine or traced lines on frost-covered wood, you might hear not just the present, but the future being shaped one moment at a time. In the Viking world, play wasn't something separate from learning. It was learning. When the chores were done, when the goats were herded, the hearth swept, the fishing lines checked, Viking children spilled into the open spaces between longhouses, their laughter rising like smoke above rooftops. But even in play, echoes of the adult world lingered. Little boys chased each other with carved wooden swords, mimicking duels they had watched older warriors perform. Girls braided each other's hair and raced to see who could weave the fastest. Not from wool or reeds. Yet the lines between these games weren't rigid. Girls joined in mock raids. Boys tried their hand at cooking fires. Everyone knew what their future might demand of them. These games weren't random. They taught balance, reflexes, coordination, and courage. A popular game involved climbing slippery rocks near the fjord, the first to reach the top earning chunk of honeycomb or smoked fish. Sometimes children played King of the Hill, grappling and wrestling on frozen grass while elders watched, murmuring quietly about which child had the makings of a good leader. Toys were simple but rich in symbolism. Wooden boats with real sails, tiny shields painted with family symbols, carved animal figures. A whalebone toy found in a burial site in Sweden was shaped like a bear but inscribed with runes believed to protect the child. In Iceland, archaeologists uncovered dice made from sheep knuckles used in games of chance and storytelling. One ODD artifact, a spinning top shaped like Thor's hammer. It was likely a toy, but perhaps also a subtle blessing. Thor, god of strength and thunder, watching over the child's growing hands. Some toys were handcrafted by parents. Others were made by the children themselves, carving during quiet hours. Even the act of toy making taught patience, design, and fine motor skill, all of which would serve them later when repairing tools or crafting weapons. Yet play wasn't confined to daylight. In winter, when snow blanketed the ground and daylight waned quickly, the hearth became the center of evening amusement. Children reenacted sagas with sock puppets or small figurines. They acted out legends of Odin's ravens or Freya's cats, while older siblings provided sound effects using carved flutes or banging spoons. These moments weren't trivial. They were rehearsal for adulthood, training for memory, for speech, for performance. A well-told story could one day save lives, forge alliances, or win back stolen land. But not all games were innocent. Some had sharp teeth, like the infamous horse fights, where children would mount one another and try to wrestle each other to the ground. Others involved swimming in freezing water or sneaking up on livestock without alerting them. All tests, all dares, all echoes of a culture obsessed with readiness, and some games danced too close to danger. One 10th century story recounts a boy who climbed a mast pole to prove bravery during a feast. He slipped and fell, but instead of punishment, He was honored with a poem that began, "He rose as high as Odin's breath." The lesson wasn't about failure, it was about trying. There was a darker side too. Not all children had equal access to play. The children of slaves, thralls, had different lives entirely. Many worked long hours alongside their parents with few breaks. They might not have toys or warm meals, but they still learned through observation, through whispers behind doors, through watching the master's children from afar. Sometimes they became foster siblings, raised in the same household but never truly equal. Yet, in a strange twist of Norse custom, there were cases where thrall children, if gifted or loyal, were later adopted into families or freed. One saga tells of a boy named Kettle, born of a slave mother, who became a master shipbuilder because he copied techniques by watching through a crack in the longhouse wall. Whether true or myth, the message was clear. Even those at the margins could rise. And what about celebrations? Seasonal festivals like Yule, Blot, and Midsummer offered children more than just roasted meats and songs. They were immersed in rituals, lighting candles to ward off trolls, helping to hang evergreen branches, or running races in honor of the gods. Children often received small gifts, beads, sweets, or scraps of colorful cloth. One odd festival detail? In some villages, children dressed as spirits and playfully haunted the adults. This may have been an early version of role reversal or even a Norse ancestor to Halloween. Historians still debate whether this practice was widespread or isolated to certain regions, yet even fun carried weight. Vikings believed that every act, especially one shared in public, helped shape a child's fylgja or personal spirit guide. A generous laugh, a clever reply, a brave climb, they weren't just character traits. They were spiritual markers, and this belief lingered into adolescence. Around age 12, children's games shifted. Boys started to train more seriously in weaponry, first with wooden swords, then with dulled blades. Archery contests became more than fun. They were community events where status was quietly assessed. Girls took on greater responsibilities in managing the household, brewing herbs, and mediating small disputes among siblings. But the foundation for this maturity always traced back to play. What looked like a child skipping stones might later become a warrior who judged wind and wave during sea battles. A girl who won every hide-and-seek game in the village might grow into a trader who could read faces across crowded markets. Every giggle, every dare, every fall was part of the shaping, and the parents, rough, calloused, watchful, knew this. They encouraged the games. They told stories of gods who once played as children. They hid smiles behind serious faces when a daughter outwitted a visiting uncle or a son mimicked the clan chieftain's gait, because in their hearts, they knew tomorrow's sagas are born in today's games. Adolescence in the Viking world wasn't a slow, cushioned drift into adulthood. It arrived swiftly, often without ceremony, announced by a single morning when a boy was handed a tool instead of a toy, or when a girl was trusted to stir the family's stew without supervision. Childhood was brief, but its end was unmistakable. By age 12 or so, Viking boys and girls entered a new phase of life, training, toil, and transformation. For boys, that meant stepping into the warrior's shadow. Not yet old enough to join a raid, but no longer young enough for games, they trained under fathers, uncles, or older siblings. Wooden swords were exchanged for dull iron. Archery practice moved farther from the house, often toward the forest or a nearby hilltop. Targets were no longer carved wood, but sacks filled with sand or even the carcasses of hunted animals. And the training was not gentle. One saga describes a father who made his son stand barefoot on snow, reciting battle verses until he finished. Without shivering. Cruel? Possibly. But in a land where death came quickly from blade, blizzard, or illness, toughness was considered love. But what about the girls? Adolescence for Viking girls wasn't passive. It wasn't waiting by the hearth or perfecting a smile. It was work, learning, and subtle power. Many were trained in the art of Norse magic. While not every girl became a Volva or Cirrus, knowledge of charms, herbs, and omens was considered essential. The forest became their second classroom, where they learned which root soothed pain, which bark summoned fevered dreams, and which berry to avoid at all costs. They also learned negotiation. Trade routes ran through their homes. Bartering began young. A girl who could manage a household, track provisions, organize meals, arrange trade, was seen as a future queen, even if she only ruled a farmstead. An unusual tradition. Some girls were taught to carve runes, normally a male skill. A rune stick found in Hedeby shows a poem inscribed by a teenage girl mocking her brother's swordsmanship. A joke? Maybe, but it shows that girls had voice, wit, and the means to express both. Boys, meanwhile, began traveling. It wasn't uncommon for teenage sons to be fostered out to neighboring farms or distant kin. This wasn't punishment, it was growth. New surroundings, new challenges, new eyes watching. A boy might spend a year learning how to tan hides, build ships, or train falcons. In exchange, he brought stories, gossip, and fresh perspective back to his family. And sometimes, these teens sailed farther than anyone expected. The youngest known Viking raider was 15. His name was Bjorn, and he was buried with a broken axe and a ring inscribed with "Fearless until the end." His bones show signs of healed fractures, meaning he had likely seen combat more than once. Was he brave? Foolish? Both? Historians still debate whether such young warriors were rare exceptions or a common feature of early Viking expeditions. In contrast, some girls around the same age were already running households. In one preserved legal text from Iceland, a 14-year-old widow was granted control over her property after her husband died at sea. Not only did she manage his estate, but she successfully defended it in a local court. These weren't fragile maidens. They were iron-veined survivors, but don't picture them as joyless. Viking adolescence was also full of fire, of new friendships, first love, secret meetings beneath moonlit trees. There were bonfires during festivals where young people paired, off in contests, sang songs, or carved their initials into wood. One fragment of a love poem discovered in Greenland, crudely scratched onto a walrus tusk, reads simply, "When you left, winter came." Of course, not every teen followed the same path. Some became religious, drawn to the old gods or the emerging influence of Christianity. Yes, Christianity was already creeping in through southern trade routes and coastal settlements by the 10th century. A Viking adolescent might be caught between Thor's thunder and Christ's quiet mercy. Families were often split, father clinging to Odin, daughter secretly baptized. This spiritual divide sometimes led to real tension, and others, especially those with physical disabilities or chronic illness, found different roles entirely. A boy who couldn't fight might become a storyteller or rune reader. A girl unable to bear children might become a healer or mentor. Value was not just in strength, but in contribution. A community that faced wolves, winter, and war knew how to use every spark of talent. Still, the pressure to conform could be immense. Failing to meet expectations, whether in combat, marriage, or ritual, invited whispers. One strange tale tells of a teenage boy who refused to touch weapons and was believed to be cursed. He later became a poet, and his verses outlived the warriors who mocked him. A lesson hidden in laughter, perhaps. Punishment for serious failure, however, could be harsh. Being caught stealing during adolescence might result in public humiliation, forced head shaving, banishment from feast gatherings, or in rare cases, exile. But justice wasn't always cruel. Restorative acts were common. A teen might repay a wrong by serving in the house of the injured family or building something valuable for the community. And so this strange chapter of life continued, part fire, part frost. By the age of 16, many Viking teens were expected to be nearly fully formed adults. Some married, some sailed, some stayed, but all bore the weight of decision. Whether they were raiders or rune carvers, they knew the next step wasn't optional. There's a faded gravestone in a Scandinavian valley, worn nearly smooth by wind and time. It reads, "She danced, she healed, she dared. No name, no age. But the phrasing suggests someone young. Someone remembered because in the Viking world, adolescence wasn't a bridge to cross. It was a proving ground, harsh, beautiful, and unforgettable. By the time a Viking youth emerged from adolescence, they were already woven into the fabric of their clan's future. Whether they'd taken up the sword, the loom, or the ledger, they weren't simply participants in daily life, they were contributors. Yet even with the skills, scars, and stories of adolescence behind them, full adulthood wasn't granted by age alone. It came through recognition, through ritual, through the eyes of others. For many, adulthood was first acknowledged during seasonal festivals, occasions that merged celebration and ceremony. Take Yule, the midwinter feast. Amid the flicker of firelight, with mead passed between hands and songs echoing through the rafters, certain youths were publicly named as men or women. It wasn't a formal rite of passage as in other cultures, but a communal recognition. He fought alongside us. She led the household when her mother fell ill. These were the quiet ceremonies that carried weight, but other transitions were louder. In some coastal regions, initiation rituals were practiced. One lesser-known tradition involved the trial of endurance, where young men were expected to swim in icy rivers or spend a night alone in the forest, surviving with only a flint knife. These weren't games. They were community-sanctioned transformations. Some didn't return. Those who did often came back changed, not just in spirit, but in how the community saw them. For young women, rites of passage were equally significant, though less documented. One preserved tale from Gotland tells of a girl who was given her mother's spindle and her grandmother's comb during the spring sewing festival, a symbolic passing of responsibility, craft, and legacy. These domestic tools were not mere instruments. They were symbols of trust, of domain, and in some cases, of quiet power. Marriage, of course, was another threshold. Viking women could be married as early as 12, though more commonly around 15 or older. Men typically married later, often after establishing themselves as traders or warriors. Marriage wasn't always romantic. It was frequently political, economic, or strategic. But that didn't mean it lacked emotion. Love poems carved into bone, flirtatious exchanges preserved in saga dialogue, and even accounts of lovers eloping. These glimpses suggest that affection, and sometimes rebellion, threaded through arranged unions. Interestingly, divorce was allowed in Viking society. Either partner could request it, and reasons ranged from abuse to dissatisfaction. A young woman who chose to leave a husband was not cast out or cursed. She simply returned to her family or found a new path. This autonomy, while not universal, was far more advanced than in many neighboring cultures, and while most young adults followed the expected roles, farmer, raider, healer, weaver, some defied them. There are accounts of women who refused marriage entirely, instead becoming shield maidens. While some historians debate their existence, others point to archaeological finds, graves, containing both female skeletons and weapons, as well as high-status grave goods. One, found in Burka, included a full set of gaming pieces, weapons, and riding gear, suggesting she was a commander, not a wife. Likewise, not every man chose the blade. Some became skalds, poets, whose verses were considered powerful enough to curse or praise kings. One young skald, Kormaker, reportedly wrote his first saga before turning 18 and used it to win the heart of a woman who had rejected him. His story ends in tragedy, but his talent remains etched in the lore. Religion also shaped the transition to adulthood. Most Viking youth were raised under the watchful eyes of the Norse gods. They learned to offer blood sacrifices to Thor for strength, to Freya for love, to Odin for wisdom. But by the 10th century, Christianity began to creep into Viking settlements through missionaries and merchants. For some youths, this brought identity conflict. Imagine growing up with tales of Ragnarok, only to be told by a foreign priest that your gods were false. Some rejected the new faith entirely. Others blended it, offering prayers to Christ while keeping Thor's hammer tucked beneath their tunic. In mixed communities, It wasn't uncommon for a young man to carry both a cross and a hammer, hedging his bets between heaven and Valhalla. The decisions these young adults made shaped not only their own futures, but their family's reputation. A son who earned wealth on a raid brought honor. A daughter who managed a household with wisdom elevated her kin's standing. Failure, whether cowardice in battle, laziness in trade, or scandal in love, had ripple effects. And so, reputation became currency. One's name was their shield. A tale from the Orkney saga describes a boy named Ragnvald, mocked in his youth for being quiet and weak. He later became a famous jarl, but what he remembered most wasn't the battles. It was the first time an elder said his name with pride at a feast. And yet, despite all the hardship, the Viking world was not devoid of joy. Young adults still danced. They still laughed, carved jokes into driftwood, played games on frozen ponds, and shared stolen moments behind barn doors. They still stared up at the aurora borealis and wondered what it meant. They lived hard, yes, but they lived deeply, because in this world, where adulthood was forged in frost and fire, to survive was already a triumph, and to thrive, that was a saga in itself. The Viking journey into adulthood didn't end with a feast or a wedding. It continued with a pledge to family, to clan, to legacy. It was a quiet understanding whispered between generations. You are no longer sheltered beneath our shield. You carry it now. This new role brought both honor and burden. Adults were expected to defend the farm, negotiate trade deals, raise children, tend to the gods, settle disputes, and care for elders. In a land where a single bad harvest could mean starvation, the weight of these responsibilities was immense. But this was also the time when identity crystallized. Young warriors now led raids or protected coastal settlements. Traders crossed seas not as apprentices, but as masters of their own vessels. A woman no longer learned beside her mother. She taught her own daughters, spinning tailies while spinning wool. And though their days were long and laborious, they were often rich with meaning. One little-known tradition from Iceland illustrates this beautifully: the naming of tools. A blacksmith would give his favorite hammer a name. A weaver might whisper to her loom. These objects, used daily and handed down, were believed to carry a piece of the owner's spirit. And so, naming them was a way of passing oneself on, not in blood, but in rhythm and memory. And in those memories, the cycle repeated. The now-grown children would watch their own sons and daughters toddle through the halls, mimic sword swings in the snow, or hum lullabies into the firelight. They'd recall their own first chores, their first bruises, their first true laughs, and they'd marvel at how time folds in on itself, like parchment before the scribe. But not every adult path led home. Many joined longships and never returned. Others disappeared in foreign lands, chasing fortune or fleeing shame. A few became legends, names sung by skalds around hearths or carved into stone still standing centuries later. But most simply became the strong, steady backbone of their community. They weren't heroes. They were the ones who woke before dawn to chop firewood, who delivered babies, who pulled children from rivers, who buried their dead and told the stories so the young would remember. That was adulthood in the Viking world. Messy, sacred, exhausting, and real. And as history turns its gaze to kings and conquerors, it's easy to forget these quiet lives. But their traces remain. In combs, buried with care. In spindle whorls etched with symbols. In the worn thresholds of farmhouses where generations passed through. Historians still debate the exact roles Viking adults played, how much power women truly held, how rights differed from village to village, how traditions evolved as Christianity took root. But through all the scholarly arguments, one thing is clear: Viking children were raised not just to survive, but to belong. They belonged to a lineage that stretched backward to gods and giants, and forward to us. Because each time we light a candle in the dark, or tell a tale that matters, or teach a child how to hold a tool with care, we echo them. Their story becomes our story, and in that sharing, they are never lost. The story of Viking childhood to adulthood is not one of fantasy, but of fierce reality. It's the tale of growing up beneath an open sky, surrounded by salt and snow, learning not just how to endure, but how to contribute. Each stage of life, from the first breath to the final burden, was shaped by both tradition and necessity. Boys and girls were guided by kin, by myth, and by memory. They were tested early and praised sparingly. But when they succeeded, their names were etched, if not in runnestones, then in the hearts of their community. We've traveled with them from cradle to longship, from lullaby to legacy. We've watched them stumble, laugh, love, and fight. We've heard echoes of our own lives, of parents hoping to protect, of children trying to understand, of young adults striving to be seen. And now, as their footsteps fade beneath layers of history, their story still lingers in bedtime whispers, in classroom questions, in the quiet admiration of lives that seemed at once distant and deeply familiar. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine that flickering hearth again. Imagine the wool under your fingers, the cold kiss of a northern wind, the distant call of a horn across the fjord. And remember this, even in the far-off north, 1,000 years ago, someone not unlike you once watched the stars and wondered what came next.